that's a tough act to follow. Big issues, but we have a big issue that we're going to be talking about too. The fate of humanity will be determined in 25 minutes. In all seriousness, it is an important topic. It's a very weighty topic, and the future of humans. We're living in an incredible time of very, very rapid advances in AI, automation, robotics. And it's faster than anyone imagined. Sergey Brin said he never saw it coming. There have been a lot of alarmist cries. Elon Musk is worrying about humans going extinct. Steve Hawking has joined that chorus. Bill Gates is waking up as well, also sending out alarm bells. There was a book, the big book this fall was Homo Deus, which predicts a very dystopian future. An age where a small group of humans controls machines who then control the rest of humanity. Pretty dark stuff. But at the same time, we've also, look at what else is happening. We've got, self-driving cars, we've got speech recognition, medical breakthroughs, incredible economic productivity. And so my first question for these very good-looking and handsome panelists here is what's your view? Are you a utopian or are you a dystopian? Somewhere in between, and why? Somebody start.
I can start. I mean, I think what we're seeing with computation, AI, and so on is the continuation of a very long-running story, which is the story of the development of technology. I mean, if there's one thing that's actually advanced through history, it's technology. It's kind of a progressive thing that's happened through history. And technology is all about taking things that we used to have to do ourselves as humans and making them be able to be done automatically. And we get to do more and more of those kinds of things. And so the question then is, what do the humans still have to do? And I think the thing to realize is what technology has been doing and is going increasingly towards is getting to the point where we as humans define the goals that we're setting, and then it's up to technology to, as automatically as possible, achieve those goals. So, when people ask, what's the space that's left for the humans? Well, the answer is figuring out what to do. The doing of it, we can automate. The figuring out what to do is the kind of quintessentially human piece.
Do you share that, or?
I do in principle, but I am much more fearful than Stephen.
Okay.
Let me start by saying that, if we were having this conversation 3-4 years ago, I would be sitting here bemoaning the eventual end of Moore's Law with all the implications of that, and would be pointing to quantum computing as something that was still 2-3 decades away.
Right.
That was the best that conventional wisdom had 3-4 years ago. Today, with advances in qubits at Intel and at IBM and other places, we're in a very, very different place. And all of a sudden, problems that we thought we had 2 decades to deal with, we're going to be facing them much, much more quickly. Right. And so on the one hand, the nerd in me is very, very happy about this. It's wonderful. The little voice in the back of my head is saying a dystopian outcome is perhaps more likely, unless we begin to take steps today.
And if we don't take those steps, then we're the proverbial frog in the pot of water on the stove?
Well, we are, because while I absolutely agree that it's up to humans to figure out what the machines, what the AI components need to do, you have corporations, you have Wall Street, you have the drive for improved productivity, you have the drive towards commoditization, right? All of these things tend to drive, I mean, I remember, I arrived in New York as a 15-year-old. The New York World's Fair was in progress, so I've just given away my age. And I went to the World's Fair that was taking place there, to the GE Pavilion, where they talked about the impact of the end-stage industrial revolution. They weren't even talking about computing back then, as so significant that by the beginning of the next millennium, we would have a 2.5-day work week. Well, we all know what bullshit that turned out to be.
Well, but I mean, taking so let's talk about then about what makes us humans and what is what in our title in our of the session there's this implied threat that humanity is imperiled. That there's something about what makes us humans. Is Stephen would call it the deciding, I guess, or telling machines what to do. But we could let's get specific here about how are these technological forces changing our creativity, what it means to be curious. If a machine's always telling me and knows what I want before I want it, then do I need to be curious anymore?
Look, the thing that one realizes is, everything that one can define what one wants to have happen, one can potentially automate that piece of functionality. Now, that's what I've spent my life doing, is taking things where one can define what one wants, then one can automate it. Even if it's something like create something, create an interesting artwork. I've done things, other people have done many things with that where, in fact, mass customized art, where you say, okay, I want this wonderful, flooring pattern that fits in this weird shape. Nobody's ever made one of those before, but we can automatically create something that's really good. The idea that sort of creativity is some uniquely human thing, that idea is not right. The question, when you peel it back, I think what you realize is the only thing that we ultimately have is defining what the purpose is, because there is no intrinsic purpose.
But is there room for all of us to help define purpose, or is there a small group?
I think that's absolutely right, but there's one issue that you have to address, and that is, look, every piece of technology that I've ever encountered, every advance in computing, is something that can be put to good use, and many of us in this room have been in positions to exploit that. That's wonderful. The problem occurs from a societal standpoint when people begin to lose opportunities for employment because a machine could do a task more cheaply, more effectively, etc., right? And so what happens, we all know that we've already had enormous wealth stratification. We all know that there have been societal changes in the last few decades that have come about as a consequence of technology. And what happens when you put that on fast forward? Because there is it's more than even a generational change in terms of computing technology. It's certainly a massive change in the capacity that we will able to process. And when that happens, and more people either need to be retrained or need to be repurposed, which is a horrible word to use with people. And what happens from a societal standpoint?
So, I mean, one question is, what of the jobs that exist today, what will they look like in the future?
Right.
And, you can go look. I've done a whole study of, which eventually I'll actually put out there as a blog or something, of what's happened to jobs over the last 150 years. And you see all of these features of history and all these curves of, agriculture disappears, healthcare goes up, all these kinds of things. So there's a question of which jobs are going to go extinct quickly.
But so do you buy the argument, or the utopian or dystopian that there's only, we could have a 2.5-day work week, or that there could be mass unemployment, that, in other words, do the historical trends apply, or, and hence the discussions around universal incomes as a way of people who don't have jobs.
The concept of a 2.5-day work week is just naive. The way commerce works is competition is created for the benefit of ostensibly the consumer or the party that provides the capital, but competition is created, and that competition causes us to work not 2.5 days a week, but 6 to 7 days a week, right? That's kind of the real world situation. I think if there is a solution, and it's something that we just chatted about, it touches on the whole area of just what is a human, what happens to us when, as you, Stephen, put it, it is inevitable that whatever deficits we have as living organisms can be offset by computing.
I mean, that's a philosophical question in some
Yeah.
respect, right? We're all closet philosophers here on stage.
Yeah.
That you love someone for their faults, but if you have no faults, then are you human anymore?
Oh, we'll
Or-
still have plenty of faults.
But just to come back to this question about wealth creation and so on. I mean,
Okay.
in a sense, there are countries, places where you can just mine wealth out of the ground, where it's just sitting around there. Okay, we have, with the computational universe that's out there, we have sort of an inexhaustible supply of wealth, and we humans are just starting to learn how to mine that. And that's kind of an interesting economic moment, because it's kind of like for all of humanity, we get something which is kind of a supply of wealth in the same way that a mining wealthy country has had it. And I think that the consequences of that, so then the question is, what will the humans do?
Yeah.
And we can look at different kinds of areas. There are things which involve, for example, repeated judgment calls, whether it's a radiologist reading an X-ray, whether it's a person making some repeated judgment call in some lower level legal situation or something like this. These repeated judgment calls will be automated probably pretty quickly.
Yeah.
And the more rules-based, the sooner.
Yeah. And those are all fairly narrow applications, right?
But they
And-
represent a reasonable number of
Yeah.
jobs.
And then, but I think what people both excites and scares people is talking about more generalized. When will AI match human intelligence? Is often a question people ask.
A different question would be,
It's not a good question.
if you look at the kinds of jobs people do, what do people do, and you ask which of these things can be done better by machines than by people, there are things where it's a question of people persuading people. You actually kind of need a person there to have to have the sort of commitment that there's actually a person who is trying to convince me to learn something in school or buy this thing or whatever else.
So then, I mean, I just want to try to pin you both down for a minute.
So-
are we heading to a place where there won't be enough jobs, where there will be fewer jobs, and there will be people who do not work?
So let me try it this way. I'm the guy who for years has been saying that AI is an inappropriate label for what we're talking about.
Okay.
It's not artificial, it's quite real. And in its present form, it isn't intelligent. It's a narrow vertical expert system, right? Now, you put enough of these narrow vertical expert systems together and integrate them in some fashion, and you begin to have an object that begins to resemble perhaps intelligence. And as computing capacity and resource grows dramatically over the next decade, that becomes more and more viable, right? So that part of it, I think, is pretty clear. The challenge is that, I mean, look, there will always be work for a plumber. I don't think we're going to.
Really?
Yeah, I think so.
Really? I think it's a question
of time.
No, I mean, one of the issues that's holding back a lot of jobs being automated is lack of dexterity on the part of robots. That's a problem that has nothing to do directly with computing. It's a problem I think will be solved. I even have ideas about how to solve it. Right.
Yep.
Once that's solved, I don't think there's going to be work for plumbers.
Okay. So that's one more off the list, right? And so by the way, I was going to say plumbers, carpenters, but it's true, I guess, if the robots can have the mechanical dexterity, so to speak, those jobs become vulnerable too. So, the way I articulate it is I have a 3-year-old and 7-year-old granddaughter. And the day they come to me and ask for a suggestion on what they might do for a living when they grow up, I'm not sure I'm going to have a sanguine answer.
I'll tell you what my answer is.
What's your
to that
answer?
question.
I'd love to hear
You've
it.
got children too.
Yes, right. Well, my children decide what they're doing for themselves. But my general answer to people who ask, what's the future of kind of activities? Think about a field, call it X, whether it's archaeology or zoology. And my claim is there either is now a computational X, or there will be. If there isn't one now, that's a really good thing to get into, because every field is being sort of computationalized. What I mean by that is that there's kind of there's a way of thinking about things, there's a way of approaching things that involves kind of structured thinking, data, these kinds of things. And what we're seeing is some fraction of the world has been computationalized, some fraction has not been. That will be a growth area. The people who understand sort of computational thinking, those will be the people who will be able to lead and figure out what to do.
And at scale, the people who, or the entities that best understand computational thinking right now are corporations. You mentioned one of your fears is that corporate greed may lead to some negative outcomes.
And by the way, this is coming from a guy who hates regulation.
Sure.
On the assumption that whoever gets paid to circumvent regulation is always going to make a lot more money, at least in the US and Western world.
Right.
So we are in an area that is totally absent regulation.
So
we are in
the
an area
societal
that's,
organization then is another thing that could be implicitly imperiled.
yes.
And so then how do you safeguard against that? I know, Stephen, you've written about or called for, described maybe, an AI constitution. You know, there are other frameworks out there. You know, Isaac Asimov, you know, very famously gave us the 3 laws of robotics that seem to have held up, but will they still apply?
So I think this is the question.
You know, how do we?
Somebody has to tell the AIs what to do.
Okay.
And let's imagine that, you know, an AI, a box that does computation. Computation is very powerful. You can have a box that's doing incredibly powerful computation, but it is aimless computation unless it is given some kind of purpose. I mean, I happen to have spent a bunch of my life studying the basic science of computation, and out in the sort of computational universe of all possible computations, there's amazing stuff going on, very similar to what happens in the physical universe. Amazing kinds of processes going on. But unless they are sort of channeled for some purpose, they're both largely irrelevant to humans, and they're not competitive with humans either. So the issue is, you know, we have to sort of tell the AIs what to do in this kind of area of, you know, smart contracts and so on, and being able to define, you know, this is what I generally want my AI to do.
But who will do that? I mean,
That's a really good question.
That's my question.
That's a really good question. I mean, so, you know, I've spent some part of my life developing what's now Wolfram language, which is this thing that allows you to kind of just talk about things in the real world in a precise way. I'm sort of working in the direction of trying to make kind of a symbolic discourse language that lets one kind of describe the kinds of things that one would now describe in legalese and so on, and sort of set it up so that one can sort of describe to the AIs what our human preferences actually are. Now, the next question is, so what do we tell them? You know, people have the idea there's some sort of mathematical theorem-like thing. It's a little bit like Asimov's laws of robotics, where it's just like 3 lines that say, you know, here's what we want the AIs to do, you know.
Right.
I don't think, you know, the lesson from human law is it doesn't work that way.
Well, but human law is often contradictory in some ways.
Well, it's also not,
right?
it's not philosophically contiguous. So let me back up just for a second. We talked about Asimov's rules,
Yeah, well,
right?
you know, it's, you know, do no harm to humans, obey humans, and protect itself.
I think
or protect
we
thyself.
haven't even begun to scrape the tip of the iceberg, because I'll just give you one really simple example. An autonomous vehicle,
Okay.
should it preserve itself with 1 passenger, or should it preserve the car it's about to hit with 5 passengers in it, right? We haven't even begun to address that stuff.
So what would a rules-based solution to that?
Yeah,
you know,
well, I mean,
ethical
that's a
challenge
classic ethics thing. You know,
Yeah.
It's a trolley problem,
Yeah,
right?
it's
It's
right.
a classic ethics
Yeah.
dilemma.
But it is in the eye of the beholder in the current environment. We are not a philosophically contiguous society, and so if you're a corporation and your motive is profit, you will put people out of work and find ways of doing things more efficiently because your mandate is to deliver earnings to your stakeholders, right? If you are a malevolent government, you can put it to use in other ways. If you are a group of theologians, you will come up with yet a different answer. And at the moment, there isn't one solution for the world, and different parties will put different rule sets against, with different objectives.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, that's why there are different countries in the world. There's
Yes.
a couple of hundred countries in the world. And that's because, maybe there should be 5,000 countries in the world. It's hard to estimate how many countries there should be in the world, so to speak.
And it doesn't say in Genesis that the good guys win.
Yeah. But no, I think that this question of, can we invent the one perfect kind of mathematical set of principles that will determine the AIs for the rest of eternity? The answer, I think, is no. In a sense, what we're seeing with AI...
I'd settle for the next 10 years.
Fair enough. I'm reasonably confident about the next 10 years.
Okay.
I'm not so sure about the... I mean, in the longer future, what we're seeing is we're being forced to look at ourselves and ask what is the essence of humanity and what is it that we... if we could define an AI constitution, that would be the thing that determines how the AIs are going to work for the rest of time, so to speak. What would we want it to say? Now, I was realizing recently, it's kind of a scary thought, because if we look at many of the religious traditions, for example, a few thousand years ago, people said, this is the set of principles that we want to live by, and then a few thousand years go by, and some people say, well, maybe that wasn't quite right, but they're still those same principles. Now, if we decide to burn into our AIs for the rest of eternity a set of principles that we invented in 2018 or something, how does that work for the future of our species?
Well, and we haven't touched on this, but part of what makes us human is our human body, and we're augmenting our bodies with chips inside, longevity, people popping pills at MIT, or are we going to have a merged consciousness with chips implanted in our brains? And does that somehow tie into behavior or impulses? And so that we sort of latch into this big network of, a big computer network in some ways. I mean, is that frightening or encouraging?
It's a huge question, and as I said at the beginning, the nerd in me says, bring it on. I love it, right? Never been more excited. The little voice in the back of my head says, this is coming faster than anyone thought it would, and we have not prepared for it. We haven't put any guardrails on it. We haven't even frigging thought about it. And I'm delighted that, it's not just people like Bill Gates. I mean, Jack Ma is talking about it, Masayoshi Son is talking about it. And if you think we've had a rate of acceleration in technology up until now, you better buckle up your seatbelt, because what's going to come in the next few years is going to come so fast and raise so many questions, both moral and ethical, and societal, and we have to start a process.
Do you want? We have.
So I was going to comment. Running out of time.
I want to get one more question.
Yeah, right. Okay. So I was just thinking about the ultimate future of humanity, and it's kind of the one version of it is the trillion souls in a box, so to speak. Then the question is, what do those souls choose to do? What do they see as being their life purposes in the sense of life in a generalized sense? And I have to say I was very depressed about this sort of view of the future of humanity until I realized something significant, to me at least, which is you go back 1,000 years and you talk to somebody about what their purpose in life was and so on, and then you describe to them what happens today. Many things we do today are undescribable to somebody from 1,000 years ago in terms of why do you walk on a treadmill for an hour a day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What I realized is that, what I realized is that at any time in history, at any time in sort of the evolution of society, there will be things which seem meaningful to the entities that exist at that time. And I don't think it's the case. If we imagine, we might think the trillion souls in a box will just be playing video games for the rest of eternity, but to them, so to speak, that activity, which to us looks like it's video games for the rest of eternity, can be as meaningful as the activities that we're doing today are to us, but wouldn't seem to somebody from 1,000 years ago. That's my slightly optimistic view of a complicated future.
All right, so you're optimistic, right. And unfortunately we're out of time. But I wanted to, hopefully we gave you something to think about. The fate of humanity continues to weigh in the balance here. And thank you to Stephen Irwin. Thank you. Also, I'm sorry, one more thing. There's a Erwin's going to do a Q&A after this, out on the Q&A stage to the left outside the center stage entrance. Thank you, everybody.
That was fun.